The tension was palpable as the events continued to unfold. Natalia, still furious, was now trying to regain her composure, but it was clear she was unraveling. Her expression was no longer one of calm elegance, but one of panic and desperation. The whispers in the restaurant grew louder, and it was clear that the atmosphere had completely shifted. No one was focusing on their meals anymore. All eyes were on the drama unfolding before them. Ricardo sat frozen for a moment, processing what had just happened. The reality of his wife's betrayal was sinking in, and he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of it. His hands shook slightly as he rested them on the table, his gaze shifting between Natalia and Mateus. Natalia, now defeated, seemed to realize that there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. Her eyes darted around the room, but no words came from her lips as she saw the look of disgust and shock on the faces of the other diners. The sirens continued to wail in the background, growing closer as the police officers made their way to the table. When they arrived, they wasted no time in assessing the situation. The first officer, with a calm but firm demeanor, asked, "What's going on here?" Ricardo stood, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the situation. "This boy says my wife poisoned my food," he explained, gesturing to Mateus. The officer looked between the three of them, his gaze narrowing as he asked, "Do you have any explanation for this, ma'am?" He turned to Natalia, who still seemed to be struggling to hold herself together. Her response came in a flurry, defensive and dismissive. "This is ridiculous. He's just a street kid trying to cause trouble. Why would anyone believe him over me?" Her words echoed in the room, but this time, they weren't as convincing. The officer didn't seem swayed by her protests. "We'll need to test the soup," he said simply, signaling to his partner to take the bowl. As the test was conducted, the tension in the room grew thicker. Natalia's face flushed with fear, and the air seemed to hang heavy with anticipation. Mateus remained calm, but his heart pounded in his chest. He had done all he could to stop the impending danger, but would it be enough? The officer turned to Natalia after examining the contents of the soup. "Ma'am, I'm afraid we need to take this further," he said, his tone now serious. The truth had come out, but the consequences were just beginning to unfold. As the officer spoke, Natalia's face drained of color. For a moment, it seemed as if she might collapse right there in front of everyone. Her carefully crafted image was crumbling before her eyes. She took a shaky breath, her eyes darting from the officer to Ricardo, and then to Mateus, who was still standing firm, his resolve unwavering. Ricardo's voice broke through the silence. "Natalia, is this true? Did you really?" His voice faltered, the pain of betrayal evident in every word. Natalia's gaze dropped to the table, her fingers trembling as she gripped the edge. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The truth was undeniable, and the more she tried to deny it, the more it seemed to suffocate her. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I thought I could get away with it. I thought." Her voice trailed off as the weight of her own confession began to sink in. Mateus stepped forward, his eyes locked on hers. "You poisoned him, didn't you?" His voice was calm, but there was a cold edge to it. "You tried to kill him." Natalia's eyes widened, the full realization of her actions hitting her with the force of a freight train. She opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came out. She could barely make sense of the mess she had created, let alone explain it to anyone else. The second officer, who had been silently observing the scene, finally spoke up. "We'll need to arrest you, ma'am. You've committed a serious crime." As the officer moved to place handcuffs on Natalia, she didn't resist. She simply stood there, defeated, as the gravity of the situation took hold. She had betrayed the man who had loved her, and now she was facing the consequences of her actions. There was no escaping it. Ricardo watched as the officers led her away, his heart heavy with a mix of anger and sorrow. He had loved Natalia once, but now he realized that the woman he had known was nothing more than a stranger. She had manipulated him, used him, and in the end had tried to destroy him. Mateus turned to Ricardo, offering a comforting nod. "You're going to be okay," he said quietly. You did the right thing. Ricardo nodded, but his mind was still reeling from the shock of it all. How had it come to this? How had the woman he had trusted so deeply turned into the person standing in front of him now? As the police officers escorted Natalia out of the restaurant, the room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The tension that had hung in the air for so long began to dissipate, but the memory of what had just transpired would linger for a long time. Ricardo sat back down at the table, his hands resting on the edge. He felt numb, as if the world around him had stopped moving. His stomach was still unsettled, but not from the food. The poison had been purged from his system, but the poison in his heart remained. The truth had come to light, but the healing would take much longer. The days that followed felt like a blur to Ricardo. His mind replayed the events over and over, each moment etched into his memory. He couldn't shake the image of Natalia's face when the truth had finally come out, nor the feeling of betrayal that had settled deep within him. He had never imagined that someone he had once loved could turn on him so completely. Despite everything, he couldn't help but wonder what had driven her to do it. Had it been desperation? Greed? Or was it something darker, something that had been hidden beneath the surface all along? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He opened it to find Mateus standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee. Thought you could use this, Mateus said, a sympathetic smile on his face. Ricardo stepped aside, letting his friend in. They sat down in the living room, the weight of the silence between them palpable. Mateus took a sip of his coffee before speaking. I know it's hard, man, he began, his voice low. But you've got to understand, what she did, it wasn't about you. It wasn't even about her. It was about something broken inside of her. People do crazy things when they're desperate, or when they've lost control. You didn't deserve any of this. Ricardo nodded, staring at his coffee. His fingers traced the rim of the cup absent-mindedly, as if trying to find an answer to all the questions swirling in his head. But why me? Why did she go this far? He asked, his voice thick with confusion. Mateus hesitated, his gaze distant. Sometimes, when people get caught up in their own lies, they can't see the damage they're doing. She might have thought you were the only thing standing in her way, that you were going to ruin whatever plans she had. He paused, taking a deep breath. But she was wrong. You were never the problem, Ricardo. It was her all along. The words hit Ricardo like a punch to the gut, and for the first time in days, a sense of clarity began to emerge. He had spent so much time blaming himself, wondering where he had gone wrong, that he had failed to see the real issue. It wasn't him. It was Natalia. He let out a slow breath, trying to gather himself. I don't know how to move on from this. How do I forget something like this? Mateus leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. You don't forget, he said softly, but you can learn to forgive. Forgiving her doesn't mean what she did was okay. It means you're giving yourself the freedom to move forward. You can't hold on to this forever, Ricardo. It's only going to keep hurting you. Ricardo looked at his friend, the weight of the words sinking in. I guess I have a lot of healing to do, he murmured. You do, Mateus agreed. But you're not alone in this. You've got people who care about you, who've got your back. You're going to get through it. For the first time in a long while, Ricardo allowed himself to believe it. He didn't know what the future would hold or how long it would take, but he knew that, somehow, he would find a way to move forward. One step at a time. In the days that followed, Ricardo began to reclaim pieces of himself that he thought he had lost forever. He took long walks, spent time with friends, and focused on the things that brought him peace. Slowly, he began to rebuild his life, not around the woman who had betrayed him, but around the man he was becoming. Though the scars of the past would never fully fade, he knew that in time, they would no longer define him. He was stronger than he had ever realized, and as long as he kept moving forward, he knew he would be okay. The weeks passed, and slowly, Ricardo's life started to regain a sense of normalcy. He'd taken to spending more time outdoors, finding solace in the rhythm of his daily jogs and the steady hum of his surroundings. Nature had a way of grounding him, reminding him that, despite the chaos in his personal life, there was still beauty to be found in the world. He focused on his work, diving into his projects with renewed energy, and even began picking up hobbies he had once enjoyed but had let slip away. One evening, as he sat on the balcony of his apartment, gazing at the sunset, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Mateus, simply saying, "You good, man?" Ricardo smiled to himself, feeling the weight of the last few months finally lifting, even if just a little. He typed a quick reply, "I'm getting there. One day at a time." A few seconds later, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a picture of Mateus with a goofy grin, holding up 2 concert tickets. "You and me, bro, rock concert next weekend. What do you say?" The idea of going out and letting loose after everything that had happened felt both exciting and intimidating. But it had been a while since he'd let himself have fun, and maybe it was time to embrace it. "I'm in," he texted back, his heart lifting at the thought of something to look forward to. That night, he went to bed with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. The future no longer seemed like a distant, uncertain blur. He had control over it again, even if it meant taking small steps. The day of the concert arrived, and Ricardo found himself standing in the crowd, surrounded by the vibrant energy of people singing along to the music. The loud beats, the flashing lights, and the sense of freedom in the air felt like a release. For a few hours, he could forget about everything: the betrayal, the pain, and the heartache. All that mattered was the present moment, the camaraderie with his friends, and the music that brought them together. As the night wore on, Ricardo felt something inside him shift. Maybe it was the music, or maybe it was the simple act of being in a place that wasn't filled with reminders of his past. But he realized something important: he was starting to heal. Not in some grand, dramatic way, but in a quiet, steady process that was taking place without him even realizing it. The pieces of himself he had lost were starting to come back. After the concert, as they walked out into the cool night air, Mateus slapped him on the back. "See? You needed this." Ricardo laughed, feeling lighter than he had in months. "Yeah, I guess I did." Over the next few months, Ricardo continued to rebuild his life. He kept in touch with his friends, traveled a little, and reconnected with parts of himself he had forgotten. There were still days when the past would creep up on him, moments when he would remember Natalia and the way things had ended. But with each passing day, the pain softened. It no longer had the power to control him. And then, one morning, as he stood in front of the mirror, tying his shoes for his morning jog, he caught his reflection. For the first time in a long while, he didn't see the man who had been betrayed or the man who had suffered. Instead, he saw someone who was healing, someone who had gone through the fire and come out the other side stronger. He smiled to himself, feeling a quiet pride. Maybe the road to healing wasn't a straight line, but he was walking it, and that was enough. The future still held its uncertainties, but for the first time in months, Ricardo felt ready to face it. With each step, he knew he was moving closer to the person he was meant to be.